Unbelievable. I never thought you'd do something like that to me.
Does he know I'm here?
Don't worry, honey. That idiot won't know you're here.
So your mother is here, right?
Dad, that's him.
I know, son. I didn't come here to beg you to stay. I came so my son could see, with his own eyes, exactly what his mother chose over her family. Before we begin, I'd like the court to hear something. A recording. 2 years old.
Kamari,
It's over.
My name is Kamari Brooks. I'm 46 years old, and for most of my adult life, I believed in one simple truth. If you build something with your own two hands, a house, a family, a marriage, nobody can take it from you. I was wrong. On a gray Tuesday morning in October, I stood in a marble hallway in downtown Chicago, watching my wife, the woman I'd been married to for 20 years, sit 2 feet from another man, her hand resting easy in his like she'd never worn my ring at all. What she didn't know, what she was about to find out in front of a judge, a room full of strangers, and our 18-year-old son, was that I hadn't come there empty-handed. I'd come with 2 years of silence, a flash drive, and a boy who'd been quietly recording his own mother without either of us knowing the other was doing it. 20 years of marriage, nearly $200,000 in savings I'd broken my back to build, dollar by dollar, shift by shift. And a wife who thought she'd already won. She had no idea what was coming. Before we get into the story, let me take you back to where all of this really started. Not in that courthouse, but on a porch swing in Chatham that's been creaking since before I was born. The morning of October 14th started like any other. Rain had been falling on the south side since before sunrise, the kind of steady Chicago rain that doesn't announce itself, just settles into your bones and stays. I stood at my kitchen window on 83rd Street, coffee going cold in my hand, watching water run down the driveway in thin silver lines toward the storm drain. I'd lived in that house for 18 years. Bought it with my own two hands, back when I was still pouring concrete and framing walls for other people's dreams, before I ever got the chance to build my own. The porch swing out front had been there since the Eisenhower administration, or so my neighbor Otis liked to joke. And it still creaked the exact same way every time you sat down on it. A low, tired groan, like it was as worn out by life as the rest of us on that block. Zaire came down the stairs at 6:40, already dressed, a garment bag over his shoulder holding the one suit he owned. 18 years old, 6'2", built like he'd spend his whole life on a basketball court, which he mostly had. He'd only just turned 18 that spring, and some mornings I still forgot he wasn't a boy anymore. He didn't say much that morning. Neither did I. There wasn't much left to say that the silence hadn't already said for us. "You ready, Dad?" he asked. I set my coffee cup in the sink. "Have been for a while now, son." We drove downtown together in the rain, past the boarded storefronts on 79th, past the L tracks, past 20 years of a life I used to believe in. Zaire kept his hands folded in his lap the whole ride, staring out the window, jaw tight the way it got right before he was about to say something he'd been holding in too long. He didn't say it. Not yet. The Daily Center rose up out of the gray morning like something carved from stone and indifference, 60-some stories of glass reflecting a sky that couldn't decide if it wanted to storm or just sulk. We parked on Washington Street and walked in through the revolving doors, past security, past the metal detectors, into the domestic relations wing on the 12th floor, where marriages go to end. I saw her before she saw me. Tanisha Brooks sat on a wooden bench outside courtroom 1206, her hair freshly done, lipstick perfect. A cream-colored blazer that probably cost more than my first car. Beside her sat a man I'd only seen in photographs until that morning, Harold Sutton. 40 years old, expensive watch, the kind of tan that comes from vacations I never got invited on. His hand rested on the small of her back like he'd done it 100 times before, though his eyes kept flicking toward the elevator bank, like a man already calculating his exit. Like he owned something that used to be mine. For one disorienting second, the marble hallway fell away, and I was back on 79th Street 20 years earlier, watching that same woman walk toward me in a borrowed veil, her mother crying in the second pew. I remembered thinking, foolishly, that a man who worked with his hands could hold on to anything he built if he just held on tight enough. Standing there in that hallway, coffeeless and soaked from the rain, I understood how wrong that had been. Some things don't stay held. They just wait for you to loosen your grip. Zair's fingers dug into my shoulder. I felt the tremor in his grip before I heard the anger in his voice. "Dad," he whispered. "That's him." "I know, son." We walked closer. Tanisha looked up, and for half a second, just half a second, something flickered across her face. Surprise, maybe. Or the beginning of understanding that I wasn't the man she thought she'd left behind. I looked past her, straight at Harold, then back to her, and I said the words I'd rehearsed in my head every night for the last 6 months. Today, I brought my son here. Not to beg you to stay, not to fight over furniture. I brought him here so he could see, with his own eyes, exactly what his mother chose over her family. Tanisha's mouth opened, then closed. Harold's hand slid off her back. I turned to the bailiff standing near the courtroom doors. "Before we begin, I'd like to request that the court hear something. It's on this." I held up a small flash drive between two fingers. A recording, 2 years old. The color drained from Tanisha's face so fast, it was like watching a light switch flip. She knew exactly what was on it before I ever said another word. Because 2 years ago, sitting in a hotel room she thought was empty of anyone who mattered, she'd said something out loud to Harold Sutton that she never imagined would find its way back to her own husband. "Kamari still thinks I'm on a business trip. Don't worry, baby. He doesn't suspect a thing." Zaire leaned in close, his voice shaking with something between fury and awe. "Dad, I got some of her calls recorded too, from this year. I didn't know what to do with them. I didn't want to hurt you." I looked at my son, 18 years old, carrying secrets he never should have had to carry, and something in my chest cracked open, 20 years worth of holding still, finally giving way. I turned back to Tanisha one last time before the bailiff called the courtroom to order. "I've known for a long time," I told her, quiet enough that only she and Harold could hear it. "I chose silence, not because I was weak, because I had a son to protect." Tanisha's eyes dropped to the floor for the first time since I'd walked in. What she didn't know yet, what none of them knew yet, was that silence had never meant surrender. It had meant I was watching, waiting, building a case the same way I'd built every house I'd ever framed, quietly, patiently, one board at a time, until the whole thing was strong enough to stand on its own. She was about to find out exactly how long I'd been building, and exactly how much her own timing had already cost her. To understand how I ended up in that courthouse hallway with a flash drive in my hand, you have to understand who I was for the 20 years before it. I met Tanisha at a cookout in Bronzeville when she was 21 and I was 24. She was studying marketing at Roosevelt University, sharp as a tack, always 3 steps ahead in any conversation. I was pouring concrete for a construction outfit on the South Side, coming home every night with dust in my boots and dreams bigger than my paycheck. She used to say she loved that about me, that I wasn't afraid of hard work. Back then, I believed her. We got married 2 years later, at 23 and 26, at a small church on 79th Street. Her mother cried. My father, rest his soul, told me I'd found a woman with ambition. And back then, that sounded like a compliment. For the first 10 years, I worked construction across Chicago. The Loop, the Gold Coast, high-rises going up faster than I could keep track of. I worked overtime whenever it was offered. Weekends, holidays, double shifts during the winter when the pay bumped up for the cold. Tanisha climbed the ladder at a mid-sized marketing firm downtown, and every promotion she earned, I celebrated like it was my own. I never once resented my wife for it. I was proud of her. What I didn't expect was how quietly that pride would start costing me pieces of myself. When Zaire was 12, my foreman offered me a project management position on a high-rise going up in the Loop. Better pay, better hours, the kind of opportunity a man like me doesn't usually get handed twice. I came home that night lit up like I hadn't been in years. Tanisha didn't share the excitement. I need you here, Kamari, she said, not even looking up from her laptop. Zaire needs stability, and with my hours right now, somebody has to be flexible. So I turned it down. Stayed in the job I already had, kept the same hours, kept things steady at home so she could keep climbing. I told myself, that's what a good husband does. That's what a good father does. 3 months later, at her company's holiday party, I overheard her laughing with a group of her colleagues, a glass of wine in her hand. And I heard her say the words that I've never quite been able to shake loose from my chest since. Kamari? Oh, he just builds houses. She said it light, breezy, like it was a joke everybody was in on. Like 20 years of 16-hour days pouring foundations and framing walls for other people's dreams added up to nothing more than a punchline at a party I wasn't even supposed to be standing close enough to hear. I didn't say anything that night. I just refilled my own glass and smiled through the rest of the party, because that's what I'd learned to do. Smile, stay steady, keep the peace. I told myself silence was love. I've since learned that sometimes silence is just the first mile marker on a very long road to regret. By 2 years ago, the signs were everywhere if you knew where to look, and by then, I did. Tanisha had been promoted to senior director, and with the new title came new hours, new networking events, new names that started showing up in her conversations more than they used to. One name in particular, Harold Sutton, a client from one of her firm's biggest accounts. She started coming home after 10 most nights, started taking calls in the bathroom with the fan running, started flinching, just slightly, whenever her phone buzzed at the dinner table. That same fall, I ended up in the hospital. Weeks of double shifts had finally caught up with me. My doctor at the University of Chicago Medical Center used the word collapse, which is a hard word for a man to hear about his own body. Tanisha visited twice that week, told me she was swamped at work. I didn't think much of it then. I do now. I remember the second visit clearest. 15 minutes, still in her work blazer, checking her phone twice before she'd even taken off her coat. I told myself she was tired, overworked. I didn't let myself hear what the silence between her sentences was actually saying. I didn't confront her. Not yet. Instead, I did what I'd always done when something didn't sit right in my chest. I got quiet, and I got careful. It was this past February, 8 months before the hearing, when I went looking for a tax document in her home office, and a folder slid off the shelf, spilling papers across the floor. Among them, a residential lease agreement for a 2-bedroom apartment in Hyde Park. 2 names on it, Tanisha Brooks, Harold Sutton. Signed nearly 2 years earlier, the same season I'd been lying in that hospital bed. Tucked beneath it was a bank document I only half registered that day, a signature at the bottom that looked like mine, but sat at an angle I never write in. I told myself I was seeing things. I put it back with the rest, unread all the way through. And I've thought about that decision more than almost any other since. I put the folder back exactly the way I found it. I didn't say a word. That night, I started keeping a record of my own. Dates, times, bank statements. I photographed documents on my phone when she was in the shower. I wasn't building a case out of anger. I was building it out of something steadier and colder than anger. The understanding that I was going to need proof because a man like me, quiet and unassuming, doesn't get believed on his word alone. Not against a woman who could talk her way into a room, and out of a mistake in the same breath. It was Zaire who broke the silence wide open, though, not me. About 6 months before the hearing, he came home from basketball practice early and walked into the kitchen to find his mother wrapped in Harold Sutton's arms, laughing about something neither of them heard him enter for. He backed out without a word and drove around the block 4 times before he came inside for real. He didn't tell me that night. He carried it alone for months. I didn't know what to do with it, Dad, he confessed to me later, sitting across from me at our kitchen table, unable to meet my eyes, his knee bouncing under the table, the same nervous tell he'd had since he was 7. I started recording some of her calls. I don't even know why. I guess I wanted proof, in case I ever needed it, in case she tried to say it never happened. What neither of us knew yet was just how far Tanisha had already gone in her mind, how she'd already started sketching out a future that didn't include either of us the way we understood ourselves. I found that out the same week Zaire showed me his recordings, sitting alone in my dark living room at 11 at night, headphones in, replaying a call between Tanisha and Harold that I wasn't supposed to hear. Zaire will follow me if we give him a better life, she told him, her voice light, almost bored, like she was discussing a change in dinner plans. Kamari's just a burden at this point. A burden. 20 years of double shifts, a promotion I turned down so she could have stability. All of it reduced to a single word, tossed off in a call she never thought anyone would hear. I sat in that dark living room a long time that night. I won't pretend I didn't cry. A man can be strong and still cry. I've come to believe those two things aren't opposites, no matter what anybody tries to tell you. But I didn't fall apart. I made a decision instead. I was going to wait. I was going to gather everything, every document, every recording, every piece of the truth, and I was going to walk into that courtroom on my own terms, not hers, not as a broken man begging for mercy, but as a father standing on solid ground, ready to show his son exactly what real strength looks like when it finally decides to stand up. I had no idea that night just how much further the truth still had to go, or how much Tanisha's own timing was about to work against her. Kamari heard his own wife call him a burden and chose to keep gathering evidence instead of confronting her that same night. Was that wisdom, or was that a mistake? Comment 1 for wisdom, comment 2 for mistake. Let's see which one wins. Back in courtroom 1206, Judge Renata Alvarez called the proceedings to order, and I felt Zaire's hand finally leave my shoulder as he took his seat beside me. Across the aisle, Tanisha sat straighter than I'd ever seen her, chin lifted, but her hands, I noticed her hands, were folded so tight in her lap that her knuckles had gone pale. My attorney, a soft-spoken woman named Diane Fitzgerald, who'd been recommended to me by a man I used to work concrete jobs with, stood and addressed the court. Your Honor, before we proceed to the standard division of assets, my client would like to enter into evidence a series of financial records that speak directly to the conduct of the respondent over the past 2 years. She placed a folder on the clerk's desk. Thank statements, wire transfer records, a loan document with my signature at the bottom of it, a signature I never gave. For half a second, my mind flashed back to that folder on her office floor, the angled signature I'd told myself I imagined. I hadn't imagined it. I'd just wanted, badly, not to already know. Your Honor, Diane continued, this is a home equity loan for $250,000, taken out against the marital residence on 83rd Street. It bears a signature purporting to be my client's. My client did not sign this document, has never seen this document prior to discovery, and we believe this signature was forged. I watched Tanisha's face as the judge picked up the loan paperwork. I watched something behind her eyes go very still, the way water goes still right before it starts to boil. Further, Diane said, bank records show that nearly $180,000, funds accumulated over years of my client's employment in a joint savings account, was withdrawn in a series of installments over the past 2 years and used to cover the lease and living expenses of a Hyde Park apartment shared by Ms. Brooks and Mr. Sutton. The room went quiet, in that particular way a room goes quiet right before it erupts. I heard someone behind me exhale. I heard Harold shift in his seat, the leather creaking under him. Somewhere above us, the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, the only sound in a room that had otherwise gone completely still. This was the moment I'd been waiting 18 months for. Not out of vengeance, but out of the aching need to finally be believed. Underneath the patience I'd worn like a second skin was a real fear. That if I spoke too soon, without proof, I'd be dismissed as a jealous husband instead of heard as a wronged one. What I wanted wasn't her ruin. It was simply to stop being the only person in the room who knew the truth. Watching the judge's face shift from routine boredom to real attention, I finally understood. I hadn't been weak for waiting. I'd been protecting the one piece of leverage a quiet man like me was ever going to get. That's not what it looks like, Tanisha said suddenly, her voice sharper than she probably meant it to come out. That apartment was for work, for client meetings. I was going to tell Kamari once. Once what, Miss Brooks? Judge Alvarez asked, not unkindly, but with the flat patience of someone who'd heard 1,000 versions of this same sentence before. Tanisha didn't have an answer. That's when Zaire sat forward, his voice low but no longer steady. Mom told Harold. He stopped, swallowed hard, started again, quieter this time, like he was still trying to keep himself in one piece. Mom told Harold that once the divorce was finalized, I'd go live with them, that we'd have a new life, a life without my dad in it. The room stirred into low, urgent whispers. I heard the court reporter's fingers stop moving on her keyboard for half a second before catching back up. Tanisha's face had gone from pale to something closer to gray. Zaire, that's not, she started. I have it recorded, Mom. His voice cracked once, hard on the last word, but he held himself together, jaw tight, the same way mine gets. I have you saying it. I didn't want to believe it either. Harold Sutton, for his part, had gone very quiet, his eyes fixed somewhere on the floor near his expensive shoes, like he was doing math he didn't like the answer to. Judge Alvarez set down her pen. Ms. Brooks, I'm going to need you to explain to this court, in detail, the nature of these financial transactions, and I would strongly advise you to be honest, given what has already been entered into evidence today. Tanisha's composure, the same composure that had walked into that courtroom that morning wrapped in cream-colored confidence, finally cracked. Not in anger, not yet, in something closer to panic. I wasn't trying to hurt anyone, she said, and her voice had lost all of its earlier polish. I just wanted, Harold and I were building something. I thought once it was done, once everyone saw how much better things could be. Better for who? I asked. It was the first thing I'd said since the recordings played. My voice came out steadier than I expected it to. 20 years of silence has a strange way of teaching a man how to speak calmly, even when his whole chest is on fire. Tanisha looked at me, and for one brief moment, I saw something in her face I hadn't seen in years. Not love, not exactly. Something closer to the recognition of a person she used to know. Standing in front of her, no longer recognizable as the man she thought she could quietly leave behind without consequence. 20 years I stayed quiet for my wife, I told her, loud enough now for the whole courtroom to hear. Loud enough for Zaire to hear it clearly. Because I needed him to hear it clearly. I stayed quiet because I thought that's what love looked like. Today my son is going to hear the truth. All of it. Judge Alvarez called a 15-minute recess to allow both parties' counsel to review the newly entered evidence. As the courtroom emptied out into the hallway, I sat there a moment longer, my son's jaw still tight beside me. And I understood that this exact moment, was only the beginning of what the truth still had left to reveal. Because the forged signature on that loan meant one question I hadn't let myself ask yet. If $250,000 had come out against my house, and only a fraction of it had gone toward an apartment lease, where had the rest of it gone? I was about to find out. The recess ended, and something in the room had shifted. Tanisha's attorney, a tall man in a navy suit who'd looked entirely too relaxed at 9 that morning, now sat hunched forward, flipping through papers like a man trying to find a door in a room that had suddenly lost all its exits. Diane Fitzgerald stood again, and this time, her voice carried a different weight. Quieter, but somehow heavier. Your Honor, our forensic accountant traced the remaining balance of the forged loan, approximately $68,000, once the apartment lease payments are subtracted. Those funds, combined with additional transfers made over the past 8 months, were used as the down payment on a single-family home in Hyde Park. The deed lists Harold Sutton as sole owner of record. Closing took place this past February. Not a rented apartment this time, a house, bought in full 8 months before this hearing, with money forged out of Kamari Brooks's own signature. I sat very still. I'd expected betrayal. I hadn't expected to find out my own name on paper I never signed had helped build somebody else's front porch. Diane wasn't finished. Your Honor, Discovery also produced a document dated 18 months prior to today's hearing, drafted by a family law consultant Ms. Brooks retained privately, outside the knowledge of her husband. It's titled Voluntary Reduction of Parental Rights, Draft, and it outlines a strategy to reduce Mr. Brooks's custodial involvement with the couple's son in order to smooth Mr. Sutton's transition into a parental role while the child was still a minor. 18 months before this hearing, Zaire had been 16. Your Honor, Diane continued, the plan appears to have depended on finalizing the divorce and custody terms before the child's 18th birthday this past spring. That did not happen. The proceedings were delayed by nearly a year. By the time this matter reached the court, the child in question was no longer a minor, which the people would note renders the custodial portion of this scheme legally moot, though it remains highly relevant to the pattern of concealment and manipulation before this court. I felt something settle in my chest that I hadn't expected to feel in that courtroom. Not triumph exactly, something closer to disbelief. She'd been racing a clock the whole time, and the clock had beaten her. Then Diane placed one final document on the desk. A printed text message exchange subpoenaed from Harold Sutton's phone records. She read it aloud, her voice steady and clear in the silent courtroom. If Kamari won't sign, we'll use Zaire. He trusts me more than he trusts his father right now anyway. The courtroom didn't just go quiet. It went still. The specific stillness of a room full of people who understand they've just witnessed something they'll be talking about for years. That was the moment Zaire came apart. Not the tight-jawed control from an hour earlier. This was different, raw. a sound torn out of him from somewhere he'd been guarding his whole life. "You were going to use me?" His voice cracked on every word. "Mom, I'm not a bargaining chip. I'm your son." Watching my son absorb that sentence, I understood something about my wife I hadn't let myself fully understand until that second. Her real fear had never been losing me. It was becoming ordinary, becoming the woman who just built a life instead of a bigger one. Chasing that fear, she'd convinced herself the people closest to her were obstacles to manage rather than people to protect. And Zaire had simply been the most useful obstacle in reach. My own conflict was just as real in that instant. Some old, stubborn part of me still wanted to reach across the aisle and shield her from what was coming, even now. But watching 18 years of my son's trust collapse in the space of one sentence, that instinct finally, fully let go. Tanisha's mouth opened, closed, opened again. "Zaire, baby, that message doesn't mean what it sounds like." I heard the recording, Mom. He was crying openly now, no longer trying to hide it, his voice rising with each word. "You told Harold I'd be his son after the divorce. Like 18 years with Dad didn't even matter." Harold Sutton, who had said almost nothing through the entire proceeding, suddenly stood, his chair scraping hard against the floor, loud enough that a few people in the gallery flinched, his composure finally giving way. "Tanisha, what is he talking about? You told me the loan was clean. You told me none of this would come out." "Harold, please," Tanisha reached for his arm. He pulled it back like her touch had gone cold. "You said this would be simple. Now there's a forged signature with my name attached to the money trail, and your own son has recordings? I'm not getting pulled into a fraud case." He shook his head, already backing toward the courtroom doors. And just like that, the man who'd sat with his hand possessively on my wife's back that morning was already halfway to the exit, done with her the second things stopped being clean and convenient. Judge Alvarez, who had remained largely silent through the unraveling, finally spoke, her voice carrying the weight of a ruling she'd clearly already made up her mind on. "Given the evidence presented today, the forged loan documents, the undisclosed transfers of marital assets, and the documented pattern of financial deception spanning nearly 2 years, this court finds that Ms. Brooks engaged in the deliberate dissipation of marital property. I am awarding the marital residence on 83rd Street solely to Mr. Brooks, and ordering Ms. Brooks to reimburse the marital estate for the funds diverted to the Hyde Park property, to be satisfied from her share of any remaining assets. Given the apparent forgery involved in securing the home equity loan, I am also referring this matter to the Cook County State's Attorney's Office for investigation." She paused and looked toward Zaire. "As to the matter of the child, Zaire Brooks is 18 years of age, a legal adult. This court has no authority and no intention of dictating where he lives or with whom he maintains a relationship. That decision belongs to him and to him alone." Zaire sat very still for a moment. Then he looked at his mother, not with the fury he'd carried into that courtroom, but with something quieter and somehow more final. "I don't need a judge to tell me that," he said. "I already know where I'm going." I looked at my son, who was still crying but had stopped shaking, and I put my arm around him. And for the first time in 2 years, I let myself believe that the worst of it might finally be behind us. Outside the courtroom doors, I could hear the ordinary sounds of the building going on without us. Footsteps, an elevator bell, someone's laughter down the hall. The world simply continuing, indifferent to what had just ended inside that room. It struck me, sitting there, how strange it was that a marriage could dissolve in an afternoon, while the rest of the world just kept moving. I had no idea, sitting there, just how much more truth was still waiting to surface. Not that day, but 2 years down the road, in a letter that would test my son, one final time. The gavel came down just after 2 in the afternoon, and by the time Zaire and I stepped back out onto Washington Street, the rain had finally stopped. Chicago has a way of doing that, holding on to gray skies just long enough to match whatever you're carrying inside, then letting the sun through right when you need it most, whether you believe you deserve it or not. The financial ruling became final 6 weeks later, once the forensic audit closed out. Tanisha was ordered to reimburse the marital estate for the funds diverted to the Hyde Park property, a debt that ate through what remained of her savings and forced her to liquidate her retirement accounts to satisfy it. The forged loan was referred for criminal investigation, and word of an open fraud inquiry doesn't stay quiet for long in certain circles downtown. Tanisha lost her position at the marketing firm within the month. Harold Sutton, true to the character he'd shown that morning in the courtroom, never returned a single one of her calls after that day. I heard through mutual acquaintances that the Hyde Park house went up for sale within weeks, Harold eager to distance himself from anything with her name still attached to it. I didn't feel triumphant when I heard that. I want to be honest with you about that. I felt something closer to tired. A few weeks after the ruling, Zaire and I sat together on a bench in Millennium Park, not far from the Bean, watching tourists take photographs of their own distorted reflections in that great curved mirror of steel. Zaire had been quiet most of the walkover, hands shoved in his jacket pockets, and I let him take his time getting to whatever was sitting on his chest. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner, Dad," he finally said, staring straight ahead at the skyline reflected in the sculpture. "About what I saw. About the recordings. I was scared that if I told you, I'd lose you both. That there wouldn't be a family left at all." I put my hand on the back of his neck, the way I used to when he was small enough to carry on my shoulders through this same park. "Son, I'm the one who owes you an apology," I told him. "I stayed quiet for 2 years because I was trying to protect you from a truth I thought would break you. But you'd already found the truth on your own. I just made you carry it alone longer than you should have had to." He didn't say anything for a while. We just sat there, watching the city move around us. Two people who'd both been carrying more than either of us ever let the other see. My wife had tried in the weeks that followed to reach him. Phone calls that went unanswered. A handful of letters, each one returned unopened at first, though eventually Zaire began reading them without responding. No court order stood between them. That had never been the court's to decide, and both of us knew it. It was entirely Zaire's choice, and I told him only that whatever relationship he wanted to have with his mother going forward, distant or eventually closer, belonged to him, and I would support whatever he chose, without ever making him feel like choosing her was a betrayal of me. "I don't think I'm ready to see her," he told me one evening, months later, sitting across from me at our new kitchen table in the smaller apartment we'd moved into in Chatham, closer to my sister's place, closer to the neighborhood I'd grown up in. "Maybe someday, not yet." "That's all right, son," I told him. "There's no clock on that kind of forgiveness. Take whatever time you need." I made some changes of my own in those months, too. I stepped back from the overtime hours I'd worked my whole career, took a foreman position that let me be home for dinner most nights instead of just weekends. I started spending my Saturday mornings the way I used to before life got so complicated. Sitting on that same creaky porch swing with a cup of coffee, watching the neighborhood wake up slow, waving at Otis when he came out to get his paper. And I started something new. A small support group meeting Thursday evenings in the basement of a church not far from my old house. A handful of black fathers on the south side, some divorced, some widowed, some just raising sons and daughters alone and looking for somewhere to say the things they didn't know how to say anywhere else. We didn't have a fancy name for it at first. We just called it Thursdays. 6 men became 10. 10 became 20-some by spring. I never set out to become somebody's example of anything. I just wanted my son to see that a man could lose almost everything and still choose, every single morning, to get back up and build something worth having again. There was still an ache in me those months, if I'm being honest with you. Some nights, I'd sit alone on that porch after Zaire had gone up to bed, and I'd feel the particular hollowness of 20 years unraveling all at once. Grief doesn't disappear just because justice arrives. I learned that the hard way. But I also learned that peace doesn't require the absence of grief. It just requires you to keep choosing to build, even while you're still healing. Some evenings, I'd catch myself listening for her key in the door, out of old habit. 20 years of routine slower to unlearn than I expected. I never told Zaire that part. Some griefs are a father's to carry quietly, so his son can rest a little easier. I had no idea, sitting on that porch swing those quiet evenings, just how far my son and I still had left to go. Or how, 2 years later, one final letter would test everything we'd both worked so hard to rebuild. 2 years passed the way years tend to when you finally stop bracing yourself against them. Zaire started at the University of Illinois Chicago that fall, studying social work. A decision, he told me, came directly from those Thursday evenings in the church basement, watching me sit with other fathers and listen to them rebuild their lives, one honest conversation at a time. He moved into a dorm not far from the Loop, close enough that he still came home most Sundays for dinner, but far enough that I could watch him become, slowly and steadily, his own man. The support group had grown into something bigger than either of us expected. What started as 6 folding chairs in a church basement had become a registered nonprofit with meetings in 3 different Southside neighborhoods, and I'd been asked, more than once, to speak at community events about fatherhood, patience, and what it means to build a life back up from nothing. I always felt a little strange accepting those invitations. I never set out to be anybody's inspiration. I just refused to stay broken. Zaire had grown into a confident young man, steady in a way that reminded me of myself at his age, but with something I never quite had: an ease with his own emotions, a willingness to talk about what hurt instead of swallowing it whole the way I used to. I like to think some of that came from watching me finally learn to do the same, even if it took me 44 years to figure it out. Then, on a Tuesday afternoon in late spring, just after his 20th birthday, Zaire showed up at my apartment unannounced, an envelope in his hand, his face unreadable. "It's from Mom," he said, sitting down across from me at the kitchen table without taking off his jacket. "She's been writing me every few months. I usually just read them and put them away. But this one's different." He slid it across the table, but he didn't ask me to read it. He read it out loud himself, his voice steady at first. The letter began the way most of them had, he told me. An apology, long overdue, more honest than anything she'd said in that courtroom 2 years earlier. She wrote about therapy she'd started, about finally understanding what she'd thrown away and why, about wishing, more than anything, that she could go back and choose differently. Then, near the end, she'd included something she probably shouldn't have. An old message, one she said she wanted him to see for himself rather than have him wonder about it forever. Proof, she wrote, that she was done hiding anything from him, even the ugliest parts. It was close to the same sentiment behind the text message Diane had read aloud in court 2 years before. But this time, in Tanisha's own handwriting, with her own explanation attached. "I told Harold that you were Kamari's son by blood, but that you'd be his son in every way that mattered once the divorce was final. I wrote that because I wanted so badly for us to have a clean new life together. I know now how much that cost you both. I'm not asking you to forgive me for it. I just needed you to know I finally understand what I did." Zaire set the letter down on the table. His hands were shaking, but his face had gone very still. Not the wide-open grief of the courtroom 2 years before, but something quieter, something closer to resolve. He picked the letter back up, walked to the kitchen counter, and tore it cleanly in half, then in half again, and set the pieces down beside my coffee cup. His hands were steady this time. Steadier than mine, if I'm honest. "I choose you, Dad," he said, and his voice didn't crack this time. "Not out of obligation, not because I have to, because you're the only person in my life who never once made me feel like a tool to be used." I didn't say anything for a long moment. There wasn't a version of words big enough for what I was feeling. That evening, we walked down to the DuSable Bridge together, the way we used to when he was small. Back when I'd carry him on my shoulders past the Wrigley Building to watch the boats move slow beneath us on the Chicago River. The sun was setting behind the skyline, turning the water a deep, burnished gold, and a cool wind came off the river the way it always does that time of year, carrying with it the particular smell of a city that never quite sits still. Somewhere behind us, a street musician was playing something slow on a saxophone, and neither of us moved to leave until the last note faded into the traffic noise. I put my arm around my son's shoulders. Neither of us said much. We didn't need to. I wasn't the same man who'd walked into that courthouse 2 years earlier, carrying 20 years of silence like a weight I didn't know how to set down. I was something else now, something steadier. A father who'd stood up, finally, when it mattered most. Not for revenge, but so his son would never have to grow up believing a lie. This story reminds us that the difference between patience and disappearing is a question worth asking yourself, honestly, on a regular basis for the rest of your life. If you're reading this from a recliner some evening, telling yourself that keeping quiet is the same as keeping the peace, here are 2 things worth doing this week, not someday. First, pick one evening, Tuesday works fine, and set a 5-minute timer at the kitchen table before dinner. Write one sentence in a $2 spiral notebook from the drugstore about something you've been swallowing instead of saying out loud. You don't have to show it to anyone. You only have to stop letting it live in your chest alone. Second, if there's a grandson or a son in your life who watches how you carry disappointment, invite him over this Saturday to fix something small around the house together. A leaky faucet, a wobbly porch step, and while your hands are busy, tell him plainly what a good man does when nobody's applauding him for it. Not a lecture, just the 2 of you, a wrench and one true sentence. Dignity isn't loud. It's not a courtroom speech or a slammed door. It's choosing, quietly and repeatedly, not to let disrespect become the shape of your life. And if you have sons or grandsons watching you, let them see exactly what that choice looks like up close, on an ordinary Tuesday, long before they ever need it themselves. Real people wrote these scripts with passion and purpose to spark reflection and change. AI was merely a helpful tool that polished the delivery, making sure profound messages about respect, redemption, and human dignity reached as many hearts as possible. Production team: Story and Screenplay by Quinn Fung. Character Development and Visual Conceptualization by Chris Nguyen. Video Scripting and Scene Adaptation by David Nguyen. A passionate team dedicated to bringing this story to life.